The snow that year fell as if the sky had decided to bury the whole world alive. Taimin remembered it clearly, not because he had some special memory, but because that was when he heard his father's voice for the last time. "Hold on, son," the old man whispered, wrapping himself in the only warm blanket they had not managed to sell for food. "The land will not fail you if you do not abandon it." His father died quietly in his sleep, as if he had simply grown tired of fighting the cold. Taemin was 15 then. No relatives, no neighbors ready to take another mouth to feed the village of Soren itself was barely surviving, and an extra hungry teenager was a burden no one wanted to take on. That was how he remained alone. On his father's land with his father's plow, with his father's stubbornness instead of an inheritance. 7 years had passed since that winter. Taemin had long stopped considering himself a boy life in the wilderness. Quickly turns children into adults and adults into people who have forgotten how to be surprised by their own exhaustion. His farm stood on the very edge of inhabited lands, where normal roads ended and the forest began, which the locals preferred to avoid. The land here was not bad, but the harvest rarely brought joy. Sometimes drought, sometimes unseasonal frosts, sometimes small forest animals that had gotten into the habit of spoiling the crops. In this world, farming was not the peaceful occupation of an old man with a pipe, but a daily war against the weather, against the soil, against creatures that occasionally came out of the forest, and most often against loneliness. Taemin had long come to terms with the fact that his life would be exactly like this. A hoe, a furrow, water from a distant forest spring, a meager dinner, and dreamless sleep from exhaustion. He had no artifacts. Where would they come from for a penniless orphan? He did not know magic either. He was one of those whom people in this world simply called ordinary. And yet every morning he got up because the land, as his father used to say, does not fail those who do not abandon it. The water in the nearest well had long gone rotten. The village wells had become shallow after the dry summer, and Taemin had to, as before in childhood, go for drinking water into the forest, to a small spring that flowed from beneath an old boulder on the edge of the thicket. The path there took about an hour one way. Taemin had long learned the trail by heart. Past the leaning stump, along the stream, across the clearing with tall yellowed grass, and then down into a small crevice where the spring murmured. That evening the forest was especially quiet. No birds, no rustle of small animals, only his own footsteps, and the splash of water ahead. Taemin did not attach any meaning to it. Silence in the forest had long stopped frightening him. Something else frightened him, an empty stomach, and the thought that the harvest this year would again be poor. He bent down to the spring, filling the buckets, when out of the corner of his eye he noticed a faint glow among the stones, right at the edge of the water. At first he thought it was a firefly, then the shine of mica on a whetstone, but the light did not move and did not flicker randomly. It pulsed evenly, almost like breathing. Taemin set the buckets aside and came closer. Among the wet pebbles lay a seed. It was small, the size of a thumbnail, black with veins of dark golden light, as if a tiny spark of flame had frozen inside it. The light pulsed in rhythm with something vaguely resembling a heartbeat. Taemin carefully picked it up. The seed was warm, much warmer than it should have been in the cold water of the spring. He brought it closer to his eyes, examining the veins, and for a moment it seemed to him that something like a tiny eye flashed inside, immediately hiding again in the darkness. "What kind of wonder is this?" he muttered aloud, just to hear his own voice in this ringing forest silence. He had never seen anything like it either in the conversations of wandering merchants or in the stories of old people about forest wonders. Ordinary seeds do not glow. Ordinary seeds do not warm the palm as if a living creature is inside them. His first impulse was to throw it back, who knows what kind of curse one could bring home. But Taemin had lived in poverty too long to throw away rarities. Even if it turned out to be a useless curiosity, selling it at the market for a couple of coins would already be not bad. He wrapped the seed in a piece of cloth, filled the buckets, and went home, trying not to think about the strange warmth that seemed to be felt even through the cloth of his pocket. At home, by the light of an oil lamp, he examined the find for a long time, trying to understand its nature. The seed did not resemble any plant familiar to him from years of peasant labor. The shell was hard, almost stone-like, but at the same time it trembled slightly if one listened closely, as if something inside was breathing. Taman tried to split it with his fingernail. It did not yield. He tried to cut it with a knife. The blade only slid over the surface, leaving a barely visible scratch. He even thought of tapping it with a hammer, but came to his senses in time. If there really was something alive inside, breaking it would be cruel and possibly dangerous. Maybe it is simply dead, he said to himself, lying down to sleep. In the morning, I will decide whether to sell it or throw it away. But something inside, either fatigue or vague, inexplicable feeling, made him instead go out to the small patch of land behind the house, set aside for trial plantings, and simply bury the find in the soft, slightly moist soil. He expected nothing special. He was simply tired of holding it in his hands and decided that the land would figure it out better than he would. Then he returned to the house and fell into the heavy, restless sleep of a person too tired to dream. He woke with the first rays of dawn out of habit, developed over years of hard labor. He stretched, yawned, and as usual went out to check the farm. What he saw in the trial patch of land made him freeze in place. Where yesterday there had been only a loosened lump of soil, now there rose a thin but sturdy sprout almost knee-high. The stem was dark green, in places shimmering with gold, and the leaves were narrow, sharp, as if cut from dark glass. At the very top, a small fruit was already swelling round, dark crimson, pulsing with the same inner light as the seed the day before. This cannot be, Taemin whispered, coming closer. In one night? Ordinary plants do not even sprout in such a time, let alone grow a fruit. He squatted down, studying the sprout more carefully. The stem was warm to the touch, almost alive, and when he touched the fruit, it vibrated faintly as if in response. Inside the fruit, and Taemin was ready to swear to it something was moving. The following days turned for Taemin into observation, mixed with growing anxiety and no less growing delight. The plant developed at a frightening speed. Every morning he went out and saw that the stem had become thicker, the leaves larger, and the fruit noticeably bigger than the day before. By the third day, the fruit had reached the size of a large apple. By the fifth, the size of a pumpkin. Taemin stopped taking care of the rest of the farm, spending whole days sitting beside the mysterious plant, watching as something clearly rolled inside the fruit, as if looking for a comfortable position. He tried to ask the old healer from the neighboring village, but she only shook her head. I have never seen anything like it in my whole life, son. Maybe it is a gift from the gods, or maybe a curse. I advise you to be more careful. The advice was correct, but useless Taemin could no longer stop. Something in this plant attracted him stronger than fear of the unknown. By the seventh day, the fruit had reached the size of a large watermelon, and its shell had become translucent, as if thinning under the pressure of what was tearing its way out. Taemin, examining it in the light of the setting sun, for the first time saw clear outlines inside a curved body, a long neck, wings pressed to the sides. His breath caught. This is not a fruit, he whispered. It is an egg. That night, Taemin did not go to sleep at all. He sat beside the plant, wrapped in an old blanket, and watched as the stem under the weight of the fruit began to bend toward the ground, as if nature itself was preparing for something important. Around midnight, the fruit's shell began to crack. Thin lines spread across the surface like a spiderweb, and a faint golden light broke through from within, accompanied by a barely audible sound, neither a squeak nor a quiet growl. Taemin froze, afraid to breathe, afraid to... The cracks widened slowly, painfully, and then with one sharp movement the shell opened, and onto the dew-wet grass fell a small, wet, trembling creature the size of a large cat. A dragon. Taemin would have recognized this creature even without words: a long, flexible neck, wings covered with a thin membrane, scales shimmering dark gold in the lamplight, and large, bright yellow eyes fixed directly on him. He could not move. He could not even breathe normally. The little dragon, swaying on uncertain paws, took several steps through the grass, and then, without hesitating for even a second, headed straight toward Taemin and pressed its muzzle into his knee, making a quiet, almost pitiful sound. You, Taemin whispered, touching the still cold scales with a trembling hand. You are not afraid of me? In response, the dragon only pressed closer to him, as if seeking warmth and protection. And at that moment, Taemin understood with absolute, undeniable clarity that for this creature, he was not simply the first one it had seen. He was its parent. While Taemin sat, afraid to move so as not to scare away the little miracle, the plant behind them began to change. The stem, just a moment ago strong and full of life, rapidly darkened. The leaves curled and fell off, as if years had passed in a matter of minutes. By dawn, only a dry, brittle stick remained of the plant. Sticking out of the ground, but at its very base, where the root system had been before, lay 2 new seeds. Exactly like the one he had found at the spring, black, with veins of dark golden light, warm to the touch. Taemin looked at them, then at the little dragon, dozing tiredly at his feet, and a picture began forming in his head, too grand to believe in immediately. One seed had given one dragon. The plant had died, giving all its strength to birth, and it had left behind not 1, but 2 new seeds. So this is not simply a miracle, he whispered to himself. This can be repeated. The dragon at his feet half opened one yellow eye, as if agreeing. Taemin named him Garen. The name came by itself, without any thought, as if it had risen from the depths of his memory of his father, who had told him fairy tales in childhood about mighty winged guardians. The first days with the dragon turned out to be difficult. Garen ate a lot far more than could be expected from a creature the size of a cat, and preferred raw meat, which had never existed in abundance on the farm. Taemin had to set snares for rabbits and small game, spending on hunting time that had previously gone to the fields. But there was also something amazing in this. The dragon, despite his young age, turned out to be incredibly intelligent. He quickly learned to respond to his name, followed Taemin everywhere, and at night curled up at his feet, warming him with a heat that seemed to come straight from beneath the scales. By the end of the first week, Garen had doubled in size from the size of a cat to the size of a large dog. The wings, which only recently had been thin and weak, were now noticeably stronger, and short attempts to take off ended in more and more confident jumps from a low fence. Taemin watched this with growing amazement. No living creature he had seen in his life grew so quickly. One evening, when Taemin was returning from the field, tired and irritated after another unfruitful day, 2 uninvited guests showed up at the farm, local vagrants, who in recent months had gotten into the habit of extorting food from lonely owners on the outskirts. "Well, farmer," one of them grinned, looking over the meager supply of grain in the barn, "will you share with tired travelers?" Taemin tensed. Usually in such cases, he had either to give away part of his already meager supplies or risk getting punched in the face for refusing. An artifactless peasant could not compete with 2 strong men. But this time everything was different. Garen, who had been dozing at the threshold of the house, raised his head, sensing the tension in his owner's voice. He jumped up, hissed low, guttural, not puppy-like at all, and stood between Taemin and the uninvited guests, spreading his wings so that they covered half the yard. The vagrants froze. "Is that a dragon?" one of them muttered, stepping back. Garen growled louder, and the sound sent goosebumps even over Taemin's skin, though he had grown used to him over the past weeks. "He is young," the second said, but his voice trembled. "Maybe he is not dangerous." Garen, as if in response to these words, released from his mouth a short sheaf of sparks, not flame, not yet at full strength, but bright enough to frighten both men until their knees shook. The vagrants did not try to test how not dangerous the dragon was. They turned around and rushed away, stumbling over their own feet. Taemin exhaled, only now realizing how hard his heart was pounding. "Thank you," he whispered, dropping to his knees and hugging the warm dragon neck. "You protected me." Garen rumbled contentedly, pressing closer to him. A month later, Taemin finally decided to plant the second seed from the 2 that had remained after the first plant withered. He chose another patch of land for this, slightly away from the main field, so as not to interfere with growing ordinary crops, which still remained his main source of food. The process repeated with the same frightening speed. In one night, the seed sprouted into a sturdy shoot. In a few days, it gained height, and the fruit egg began to form at the top of the stem already by the 3rd day. But this time Taemin watched more carefully, trying to understand the patterns. He noticed that the plant grew especially actively at night, as if absorbing not sunlight but something else, possibly lunar or starlight, or perhaps the very magic diffused in the air of these lands. He also noticed that the plant required certain care. The soil around it had to remain moist but not waterlogged, and the stem itself periodically needed to be lightly touched by hand, as if the plant needed contact with a living creature in order to develop properly. Garen, now already the size of a large wolf, circled near the new plant with obvious interest, sometimes sniffing the stem and quietly rumbling, as if talking to a yet unborn fellow. By the 10th day, the fruit reached full size, and Taemin again spent a restless night by the plant, waiting for the birth of a new dragon. The birth, if this word was suitable for describing the process of a dragon being born from a fruit, went similarly to the first time, but with one important difference. This time from the cracked shell appeared a creature with scales not golden crimson, but deep blue, shimmering like steel. The little dragoness Taemin, unmistakably determined her sex by the more graceful outlines of her muzzle, took her first uncertain steps, and then, like her predecessor, headed straight toward Taemin, recognizing him as a parent without the slightest doubt. He named her Sinrin in honor of the blue shade of her scales and the light rustle she made with her wings, like wind in foliage. Garen, who had watched the birth of his sister, immediately came closer and quietly, almost tenderly, touched her with his nose, as if welcoming the new creature into his little family. Taemin looked at this scene with a strange, warm feeling in his chest. He, a lonely farmer who had lost his father in a cold winter, and for years had fought for survival alone, had now become part of something greater. He was not simply the owner of land, he was becoming the father of an entire line of dragons. And as the first time, the plant that had given all its strength to birth withered by dawn, leaving behind 2 new seeds. Taemin sat on the threshold of the house, looking at the 2 new seeds in his palm, while beside him Garen and Sinrin dozed, already noticeably grown, warm, living proof that what had happened to him was neither a dream nor a coincidence. He began to count. 1 seed, 1 dragon, 2 new seeds. 2 seeds, 2 dragons, 4 new seeds. 4 dragons, 8 new seeds. If the pattern continued, the growth would not be linear, but explosive. After several cycles, he would have not simply dragons. He would have an entire pack, an entire farm, an entire breeding system of creatures that the rest of the world considered a myth or an extremely rare, almost unattainable reward for the strongest warriors and mages. "I did not simply find a curiosity by the spring," he whispered to himself, feeling goosebumps run down his back from the realization. "I found the beginning of something incredible." But along with delight came anxiety. Dragons, even small ones, were not something that could be hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone would find out. And the question was not whether they would find out, but what would happen when it occurred. Rich houses, rarity hunters, perhaps even royal emissaries, all of them would want to gain control over the source of such power. And a lonely farmer without artifacts and connections was an easy target for those used to taking what they wanted by force. Taemin devoted the following weeks to understanding how to properly care for the plants and newborn dragons, through trial and observation, since there was no one to consult. He discovered several important patterns. The plant grows faster if the soil around it is fertilized with rotted leaves and ash from a fire. Likely, the ash contained minerals that accelerated the ripening of the fruit. Dragons after birth are absolutely helpless in terms of hunting, and completely depend on the care of the one they recognized as a parent. The scales of newborn dragons are soft and easily damaged, so the first weeks required special caution when handling them. Each dragon, judging by the first 2, differed in character and possibly elemental inclination. Garen was clearly drawn to fire, often trying to breathe sparks, while Sinrin seemed to feel better near water, lying for long periods by the stream, not moving away from the water even in sleep. Taemin started a notebook, a simple one, made of rough paper, where he wrote down every observation, every pattern, every little thing that could turn out to be important. He did not know why he was doing this, simply felt that if he wanted to raise not just one dragon, but an entire system, he needed understanding, not luck. By the end of the second month, Garen had grown to the size of a large horse, and his ability to breathe sparks had turned into short, but quite tangible tongues of flame. Sinrin lagged behind in growth, but developed other abilities. Taemin was amazed to discover that she could create a thin, watery veil around herself, using it as protection from the sun or shelter during rain. One day, when the meat supplies for the dragons had completely run out, Taemin decided on a risky step to take Garen with him, hunting in the forest, where ordinary farmers avoided going because of wild boars and wolf packs. Garen, as if sensing the importance of the moment, kept focused, gliding between the trees almost silently for his size. When a large boar jumped out toward them, attracted by the noise, the dragon did not wait for a command. He rushed forward, knocked the beast off its feet with a powerful blow of his tail, and then pinned it with his paw, looking at Taemin as if asking permission. Good. Taemin exhaled, taking out his knife. This is what we need. From that day on, hunting ceased to be a problem. Garen, and soon the grown Sinrin, easily dealt with prey that before would have taken Taemin an entire day of exhausting and often unsuccessful hunting. Farming, for the first time in many years, began to bring not only survival but also hope for something more. As Taemin had feared, it was not possible to hide the existence of the dragons for long. The first to notice oddities was a neighbor, an old hunter named Park Dong-hyuk, who lived a couple of kilometers from the farm and one day saw a winged shadow the size of a calf flash over the forest. The rumor spread quickly, as always happens in small village communities. Soon in Soren, people were already whispering about the farmer from the outskirts who tamed a dragon, although most considered it just another tale exaggerated by fear or drink. Taemin tried to behave as inconspicuously as possible, limiting the dragon's outings only to nighttime hours and keeping them away from the road. But the growing size of Garen and Sinrin made secrecy an increasingly difficult task. One day, a wandering merchant came to the village, and through the carelessness of one of the village children, who had accidentally seen the dragons by the stream, the rumor stopped being just a rumor. "It is true," the merchant whispered, after listening to the boy's story, his eyes burning with excitement. "If this really is so, it changes everything." He hastily wrapped up his trade and left earlier than planned, clearly heading to someone who could use this information either for profit or for control. Taemin, having learned of this from the same healer auntie, understood. The time of secrecy was ending. He sat in the evening on the threshold of the house, looking at the sunset, spreading crimson over the fields, and beside him lay Garen and Sinrin, already old enough to give the impression of real strength. Not just cute pets. "Sooner or later they will come to us," he said aloud, addressing himself more than the dragons, either with weapons or with an offer. "And I do not want someone else to make the decision." He pulled the remaining seeds from the hiding place. Now there were as many as 6 of them, if counting those that were already being prepared for planting from the second harvest, and laid them out on his palm. The idea that had been ripening in his head over the past weeks finally formed into a clear decision. He would not hide. He would not wait until someone came and took what he had grown with his own hands, with his own care, with his own loneliness. He would become someone the whole world would know, not as a stroke of random luck that stumbled upon a rarity, but as a true master capable of growing dragons consciously, systematically, with an understanding of every little detail of their nature. "Dragon farmer," he said aloud, for the first time allowing himself to smile truly widely in a long time. "Sounds not bad." Garen, as if hearing determination in his voice, raised his head and let out a low, approving roar. Sinrin stretched and gently nudged her owner with her nose, agreeing. Taemin looked at his dragons, at the remaining seeds, at the meager but dear land inherited from his father, who had died in the cold winter and had never seen what his inheritance would turn into. "We will build here something this world has never seen before," he said quietly, rising to his feet. "And let them only try to take it from me." Ahead was a long road full of dangers, envy in others' eyes, attempts to take by force what they could not obtain by cunning. But ahead there was also hope, the very same hope his father had promised him to find in the land if he did not abandon it. Taemin, the former lonely farmer who had lost everything in a cold winter, planted another seed in the soft evening earth, knowing that tonight the miracle would begin again. And somewhere there, In the thickening twilight over the little farm at the edge of the forest, a story was beginning that would one day make the whole world speak of one name. They came to Taemin on the third day, after the rumors stopped being rumors and turned into a whisper that could no longer be stopped. First he heard the clatter of wheels on the stones of the road, then voice commands too confident for a simple merchant. And only after that did he see at the farm gate a wagon with the crest of the Lyran family on its side. 3 people stepped out of the wagon. 2 were guards in good armor, and the third was an elderly man in a long, dark cloak with a silver clasp in the shape of a spiral. His face was dry, sharp, as if carved from old wood. He did not smile, but he did not demonstrate hostility either. And this was exactly what frightened most of all. "Are you Taemin?" he asked. "Yes. My name is Eden Lyran. I represent House Lyran and its interest in rare species of magical flora. We have been informed that on your farm there grow unusual plants." Taemin did not answer immediately. He had already understood. It had not worked out to hide the dragon trees forever. Sooner or later, someone with money and power would certainly come to check the rumors. "I have an ordinary farm," he finally said. Eden shifted his gaze over his shoulder to where Garon lay in the shadow of the shed, already grown almost to the height of an adult horse. The dragon slowly raised his head and stared at the guests. Sinrin, standing closer to the stream, also straightened, and a thin, watery moisture flowed around her paws as if the air itself was trying to hide her presence. The old man's face twitched for the first time. Ordinary, then. Taemin immediately understood that the visit was not a threat in the open sense. It was an offer disguised as politeness. House Lyran would not have come here with 2 guards just like that. They already knew that something extremely valuable was happening here. "What do you need?" he asked directly. Eden did not beat around the bush. "We want to buy seeds from you. Or, if you do not want to sell, to conclude a contract. House Lyran is ready to provide you with protection, materials, feed, specialists, and access to the market. In return, we need access to cultivation and the results of breeding." Taemin smirked, dryly, without joy. "You mean to say that I should grow dragons for you? I mean to say that in a world where strong houses fight over rare resources, a loner with a dragon farm will not live long without patronage." That was true, and both of them knew it. But Taemin also knew something else. Patronage in such cases usually means a chain wrapped in velvet. First, they help you. Then they clarify the conditions. Then they begin deciding for you. And then you are no longer the master of your own land. He shifted his gaze to Garen. The dragon stood motionless, his scales gleaming in the sun, his gaze heavy and attentive. Sinrin quietly came closer and stood beside him, as if she too understood that this was not simply about trade. "I have nothing for sale yet," Taemin said. Eden was not surprised. "Then allow me at least to see your plantings, and perhaps we can discuss safe conditions." Taemin wanted to refuse, but he understood that driving them away completely now meant attracting unnecessary attention. He nodded only after a long pause. 1 round, without touching the plants. The old man agreed. Showing the farm was both pride and risk. Over the past weeks, Taemin had turned part of the empty field into a real dragon nursery. He planted each new seed with special caution. First he loosened the soil, mixed it with wood ash, then added humus from an old pile of grass, and only after that lowered the seed into the soil. He noticed that plants of this kind grew best in warm, mineral-rich earth, and reacted not only to water, but also to the presence of living creatures. The more often he stayed near them, the faster the development occurred. Sometimes it was enough simply to talk to them. Eden and his guards watched silently while Taemin walked along the beds. New sprouts were already rising there, not as tall as the first ones, but noticeably alive. Some had leaves thin like wings, others had broad and heavy ones, as if designed to retain heat. On several, small translucent fruits were only beginning to form, inside which tiny silhouettes were already taking shape. "This!" The old man did not finish. "Yes," Taemin answered dryly. "It is them." Eden came closer, but stopped 3 steps away. "Do you understand that you are growing not just a rarity? You are growing weapons, transport, guardians, perhaps even a source of influence at the level of royal politics. Taemin turned to him. I am growing living creatures. They are not weapons. In this world, the living and the useful rarely have time to be separated, the old man said calmly. He did not like that phrase. But it was difficult to argue. The world really did work exactly like that. The raid happened at night, exactly as Taemin's inner voice had warned from the moment he saw the first dragon fruit. It was foolish to think that House Liren or someone else would limit themselves to negotiations. His secret had turned out to be far too valuable. The dogs did not bark. The forest kept silent. But Garan, who had been sleeping at the threshold, suddenly raised his head and growled dully. Sinrin already a second later spread her wings and stood by the stream, ready for something bad. And then the first crossbow bolt scraped across the fence. Taemin jumped out of the house, grabbing a long farmer's hook and an old knife. In front of him in the darkness, figures were moving. 3, no, 5. All in dark clothes, without crests, but too organized for simple bandits. Take the seeds, one of them shouted. Leave only the owner alive. Garen roared and rushed forward. His scales were not yet strong enough to withstand a full weapon strike, but he already knew how to use mass and speed. The first attacker simply did not have time to move away. The dragon knocked him off his feet, pressing him into the ground. Meanwhile, Sinrin raised her head, and drops of water from the stream began to gather around her, as if the night itself had turned into a weapon. She sharply swept her wing, and a thin stream of water struck the face of the nearest enemy, knocking off his aim and making him drop the crossbow. Taemin understood. If he gave them time, they would find his dragon beds. He dashed to the far fence where the shadow of a second man was already visible and struck his knee hard with the hook. The man collapsed, and Taemin, without losing a second, tore a pouch of dry ash from his belt and threw it into the face of another one. The raiders clearly had not expected resistance from a simple farmer. And this was exactly what saved his farm. Because when they understood that the dragons were not running and the farmer was not giving up, their attack turned into chaos. One of Liren's guards, as it turned out, had not gone far and appeared outside almost immediately after the battle began. But Taemin no longer needed help. Garen and Sinrin held the yard themselves when the last attacker fled into the forest, leaving behind weapons and 2 wounded men. The farm was still standing. But the silence after the battle was already different, not peaceful, but tense. In the morning, Taemin discovered what he had been anxiously looking for all night. Traces not simply of raiders, but of those who had ordered them to go. By the fence, where a broken piece of a crossbow bolt was lying, he noticed a boot print with a silver horseshoe. Such a sign was worn by people from the city guard of private houses. Not simple bandits, professionals. Someone among the rich had already tried to seize his future dragon harvest. Adon Liren arrived before noon, this time without guards, but with the expression of a man who already knew more than he would like to admit. You had guests, he said. Yes. And you fought them off. Yes. The old man looked for a long time at the tracks by the threshold. They were not my people. I know. Taemin did not shout or accuse. The fact was enough for him. As long as he lived on this land, he would have to protect it from those who saw in it not a home, but a trophy. Adan finally spoke more calmly. Now you understand that you need help. Taemin looked at him coldly. I need allies, not masters. The old man nodded as if this was exactly what he had been waiting for. Then we will make an agreement differently. Eden proposed a new arrangement. House Liren would not receive control over the farm and would not interfere in dragon breeding. Instead, they would provide hidden logistics food, building materials, protective barriers, and information about any attempted attacks. In return, Taemin would sell them only surplus seeds and, in rare cases, train their specialists in the proper care of dragon plants, but would not reveal the full breeding cycle. This was better. Much better. But still not ideal. Taemin understood. The more people knew, the higher the risk of betrayal. And yet, he had no choice. For the dragon farm to survive, it had to grow out of loneliness. To remain alone meant to die alone. He agreed only after Eden swore by the name of the house that no member of the family would receive the right to demand complete submission from him. And one more condition, Taman said. What is it? No chains, collars, restrictors, or educators who consider dragons things. The old man was silent for a long time and then nodded. Fair. From that day on, the farm had its first external ally. By the time the next fruits ripened in the new beds, Garen and Sinrin were already almost full-fledged dragons. Not adults, they were still far from that, but already large enough not to fit in the barn and to sleep under a canopy. Taman learned more with every new plant. It turned out that different types of dragon seeds produced different offspring. One seed gave rise to a dragon with a fiery temperament and an inclination toward brute force. Another to a more cunning, water-based, and cautious creature. The third, already ripened, promised a dragon with green bronze scales and a sturdy build, judging by the movement inside the fruit. He began keeping a separate journal. Seed with a golden vein, fiery brood, seed with blue shimmer water, seed with green mist, probably earth or forest, seed with silver light, still unclear nature, possibly an air type. Thus the farm gradually turned into a nursery of varieties, and Taman thought for the first time, what if there was not simply a species of dragons, but an entire agricultural system for growing them? Not wild capture, not slavery, not taming an adult beast, but precisely farm breeding according to the rhythm of soil, season, fertilizers, and light. This thought seemed too grand, but it is exactly such thoughts that change the world. The dragons soon began not only to protect the farm, but also to work. At first, by accident. Garen, for example, once tore out by the roots an old rotten beam that was preventing Taimin from expanding the barn. Sinrin helped water the young plants, lifting water in thin streams from the brook and carefully spraying it over the beds. Then it turned out that their breath and magic could very usefully influence the growth of some crops. When Taimin planted ordinary barley near the ground where their warm footprints lay, the stalks rose a day earlier than usual. When Sinrin carried a watery haze over the field, the seeds sprouted more evenly. When Garon lay near the compost pile, the heat from his scales accelerated the rotting. Taman wrote everything down with almost religious attention. So you do not simply eat and grow, he said, looking at the dragons. You also help the land. Garen sneezed a puff of smoke. Sinrin softly nudged his shoulder as if agreeing. When the harvest of the first full generation of dragon seeds became obvious, the news stopped being village news. The farm was heard about in the district, then in the county, then in the city, and then a letter with the royal seal arrived. Taman looked at it for a long time before opening it. His fingers were in the dirt, and his heart was for some reason calm. He already knew that one day this would happen. The letter said that the crown was interested in a unique agricultural phenomenon, capable of being significant for the army, trade, and the development of hard-to-reach lands. He was offered to appear in the capital for consultation with the Ministry of Magical Resources. Eden, after reading a copy of the reply, only sighed. This is already much more serious than House Liren. I will not go, Taman said. Then they will try to bring you. They will try. The old man looked at Garen, who by that moment was already too large to be considered a pet, and at Sinrin, whose water skills were beginning to grow stronger with each day. Do you understand that the strength of your farm has already gone beyond the borders of the farm? Yes, Taman said. And that is exactly why I am not going to give it away. The royal people came after all. Not immediately, not openly. First they sent inspecting mage agronomists, then officials, then guards. Each next visit was less polite than the previous one. They were interested in whether the growth could be accelerated, whether the breeding could be controlled, whether serial breeding of dragons could be created, whether the independence of the grown creatures could be restricted. Taman answered politely only the first 2 times, then with refusals. When the third group came with documents for temporary requisition of lands for the interests of the state, Garen was already standing on the roof of the granary, and Sinrin was circling over the field, making the air become humid and heavy. This is the last attempt, farmer, the royal mage said, not hiding his irritation. Sign the papers and everything will pass without conflict. Taman wiped his hands on his trousers. No. Do you understand that a lonely peasant cannot stand against the crown? Taman looked at him calmly. And do you understand that this is no longer one peasant? He raised his hand. Garen let out a roar. Sinrin rose higher. And then at the side of the bed, where the next fruits were already ripening, the shells began to crackle. The mages froze. Taman did too. He had not expected a new wave of birth to begin at that very moment. One fruit cracked, then the second, then the third. From the earth, from the soft, warm soil, new dragons began to appear one after another. One green, with leaves on its neck. The second silver, light, fast, almost weightless. The third bronze, with scales dense as armor. Taman was stunned, but he did not lose his head. He saw not chaos, but growth. Everything was happening too quickly, but according to a pattern. The new dragons did not rush at the people. They, like the first ones, immediately turned their heads toward him, as if checking who their parent was. And as soon as they saw him, each in turn briefly nodded almost dog-like, almost solemnly. It was frightening, and majestic, and incredible. The royal mages understood this before the others. They were not facing one rarity, but a system that could no longer be taken away without losses. "Retreat," one of them said quietly. But it was too late. Garen spread his wings. Sinrin raised a watery veil. The green dragon released roots of light into the ground, making the soil under the opponent's feet become viscous. The silver one blurred its outlines, almost disappearing against the air. The bronze one simply stepped forward, and from its heavy tread the mage's knees trembled. Taman realized for the first time that his farm was no longer defenseless. After this scene, hiding was already pointless. The royal court learned everything, and now the only question was, who would be the first to manage to conclude an alliance with him? And who would decide that it was easier to burn the farm than to allow someone else's independent force? Taman understood this very well. Therefore, he did what no one expected. He began to build. Not just additional sheds or fences, he began erecting a real dragon farm of a new type, with separate nurseries by element, with protected greenhouses, with water ditches, with stone hatching platforms, and with feeding grounds where dragons could safely learn to hunt. Eden sent workers, then more people, then rare materials and barrier stones. House Liren turned from an observer into a partner, and Taman, working from dawn until night, increasingly felt that he was building not just a farm, he was creating a new way of life. The dragon farm was becoming a place where power was born, but without slavery, where rarity did not mean a chain, where the living did not turn into goods immediately after birth. And this, as it turned out, was the most revolutionary of all. One day, when 6 growing dragons were already making noise on the farm, and 4 more eggs were ripening in the greenhouse, an old wanderer came to the gate. He leaned on a staff and, judging by everything, had traveled a long way. But instead of asking for food, he asked only one thing. Does the dragon farmer really live here? Taman frowned. Who? The wanderer smiled, tiredly and almost joyfully. That is what they already call you in the neighboring lands. They say there is one farmer who grows dragons from seeds as if they were rare pumpkins. They say his pack obeys him like children. They say he refused to sell his miracle even to the crown. Taman froze. Then he looked at his dragons at Garon, at Sinrin, at the new little ones playing by the water and in the sun. He did not know who had first invented this name, but he liked it. Dragon Farmer. Not a hero, not a lord, not a mage. A farmer. The one who works with the land. The one who understands that growth begins with something small. The one who does not abandon even what others consider too strange, dangerous, or useless. Taman slowly nodded. Yes, he said. It seems that is me. And for the first time, the world heard this name not as a rumor, but as the beginning of a new era. Much more time passed. The farm grew into an entire dragon court, and around it people began to settle who needed protection, work, and hope. Dragons became not only guardians, but also helpers. Some carried water, others guarded the fields, others helped move heavy loads, and others drove forest creatures away from the harvest. Taemin continued to keep records, improve the soil, search for new ways to care for dragon plants, and understand ever more deeply that his find by the forest spring had not been an accident, but a gift that had chosen him specifically. And every time another seed gave life to a new dragon, he remembered his father and his last words about the land that would not fail if it was not abandoned. Now Taemin knew that his father had been right. Only the land sometimes knows how to grow not just bread. Sometimes it grows legends. Taemin still did not open the letter from the capital right away. He kept it on the table for almost an hour, examining the red seal, too even and official for something that concerned his farm, his dragons, and his life. Inside the letter was a short, almost dry invitation to appear at the Capital Council on matters of magical agriculture, dragon resources, and strategically significant biological forms. He especially did not like the expression itself. It sounded as if dragons were already beginning to be counted not as living creatures, but as an economic unit. He read the text 3 times, then placed the letter on the table and rubbed his forehead. "So they noticed after all," he muttered. Garen, lying by the wall, raised his head and quietly snorted. Sinrin settled near the barrel of water, half-opened one eye, and looked attentively at her owner. Both had long felt his tension. Dragons in this house were generally surprisingly sensitive to Taemin's mood. Once he became angry, heat or a damp fog began to thicken in the air. Once he became thoughtful, the whole pack grew quieter. "No," he said, as if answering not the letter but the capital itself. "I will not go there." But saying, "I will not go," was easier than doing it. Because 3 days later, a second envelope came. Then a messenger. Then a polite warning. And another day later, unknown people were noticed around the road to the farm, supposedly guarding order. Taemin understood. If he did not take the next step himself, others would take it for him. Eden Liren arrived as soon as he heard about the new pressure from the capital. Now he did not look like a calm observer, rather like a person who already knew how fragile the balance was. "If the court has become so strongly interested in you," he said, inspecting the farm, "then this is no longer a question of curiosity. It is a question of ownership." "I am not property," Taemin answered shortly. Eden nodded. "That is exactly why you need to act smarter than they expect. Growing dragons is one thing. Protecting the right to do it independently is something entirely different." Taemin listened silently. He himself already understood that a simple refusal was not enough. If he continued to sit on the land and wait, not only officials would come, but also people with crossbows, contracts, bribes, and possible accidental fires. "What do you suggest?" he asked. The old man folded his hands in the sleeves of his cloak. "Make it so that it is more profitable for the crown to leave you free than to try to take what you have." Taemin smirked. "And how do we do that?" "Show that your method of growing dragons cannot simply be stolen. That it is tied not to a secret ingredient, but to your personal connection with the land, the plants, and the beasts. And that if they try to take you away, they will lose the ability to receive all this." This already sounded more interesting. Taemin had never considered himself a scientist, but over the months spent with dragon seeds, he had become someone closer to a researcher than he himself had expected. He already knew that simple soil was not enough for these plants. A special mixture was needed. Forest humus, ash, fine sand, remnants of rotted roots, and the strangest thing, traces of magical heat from dragons that had already been born. He noticed that old beds where dragons had already hatched began to change their structure by themselves. The soil became looser, warmer, darker. Plants grew better there. Even ordinary vegetables on neighboring plots became larger and stronger. This was not simply growing dragons, it was the transformation of the land. And if the capital wanted to understand how it worked, then perhaps Taemin could show them only part of the truth. Let them see the effect, but not the source. He began experimenting with new beds. He planted one beside stones warmed by Garen's fire, another near the damp area by the stream where Sinrin liked to sleep, a third on the northern slope where the wind was especially strong, because there, according to his feelings, something else might grow, possibly airy or fast, inclined toward lightness and maneuver. Each area reacted differently. On Fireland, the seeds ripened faster but required more water. On Waterland, they grew more evenly, but the fruit formed more slowly. On the windy area, the stems were thinner, but inside the fruit, more active movement could be felt. Taemin concluded that the dragon harvest could not simply be grown, but directed. The crown's ambassador arrived accompanied by 6 warriors and 1 magister agronomist, a man with long arms, dry fingers, and eyes that looked not at things but through them. He introduced himself as Lan Keo and immediately asked to be shown the farm. Taemin refused only once. That was enough for everyone to understand. The ceremony was over. "We will not take your dragons away," the ambassador said softly but too confidently. "We merely want to make sure that such a resource does not end up in the hands of the crown's enemies." "It is not a resource," Taemin answered. "Then what is it?" Taemin looked straight at him. "Family." The magister agronomist noticeably raised an eyebrow. He had obviously not expected such an answer. The ambassador allowed himself a thin smile. "Family is wonderful, but the crown does not build policy on feelings. We are interested in the practical side. And I am interested in the lives of my dragons." Taemin cut him off. "If you want to talk in such a way that they do not hear a threat." It was a risky answer, but it worked. The ambassador understood that pressure would not work, and then he changed his tone. "Good. Then we are talking about cooperation. You supply the crown with a limited number of dragon seeds and teach 2 royal observers how to care for them. In return, you're given the status of an independent landholder, tax benefits, and official protection from illegal seizure of resources." This was already closer to what was needed. But Taemin did not answer immediately. He noticed something else. The magister agronomist had been looking all this time not at the dragons, but at the land. And not simply looking as if he were searching for the hidden structure, the very principle from which the entire farm had grown. He understood. They were interested not only in the harvest, but also in the very logic of the dragon farm. That evening, Taemin did not sleep for a long time. He sat on the porch and watched as damp fog rose over the field, and beneath it, among the warmth of the beds, shadows of eggs not yet hatched moved. Garen settled beside him, placing his heavy head on his knees. Sinrin walked along the stream, from time to time releasing a thin haze. 2 older dragonesses, already grown to the size of calves, guarded the fence. "I have to decide," Taemin said aloud. "If I refuse, they will pressure us. If I agree, they will dig deeper." Garen quietly snorted as if saying, "And what are you going to do?" "I do not know," he admitted honestly, "but I will not give them away." And at that moment, a crack came from the farthest greenhouse. Taemin rose sharply. A chill ran down his back. It was not the usual crunch of soil, and not the crack of a branch. It was the sound of birth. He ran to the greenhouse, Garen following him, and Sinrin had already slipped there before everyone else, anxiously moving her head. Inside, on the warm bed, one of the fruits had finally ripened, but it looked different from the previous ones. Its shell was not crimson, not blue, and not green, but silvery, almost mirror-like, with thin veins of white light. The fruit trembled, then again, and cracked. Taemin froze because from inside there did not fall out an ordinary, helpless newborn dragon. From the fruit rolled out a creature with a more elongated body shape, incredibly thin wings, and eyes that sparkled so brightly as if the sky were reflected inside them. The dragon was smaller than Garen at birth, but in it there was a strange, almost airy lightness. It raised its head, looked straight at Taemin, and immediately, without the slightest hesitation, went toward him. But its way was different. It did not walk heavily, did not crawl, did not dig its paws into the ground. It seemed to glide above the surface, almost without touching it. Taemin stretched out his hands and carefully picked it up. The little dragon quietly squeaked, then pressed its forehead into his chest. "You are." "Air, yes?" Taemin whispered. The creature blinked and seemed to agree. Sinrin tilted her head, attentively examining the new brother. Garen also stepped closer, but not too much. He had already grown used to being the first, but now, it seemed, understood that every new dragon would have its own character. Taman raised his eyes to the dim light of the greenhouse and understood that his farm had just entered a new phase. He named the new dragon Veyron, because he was silver and because his movements reminded him of the movement of the night wind between the hills. Veyron turned out to be incredibly quick at learning. Already on the second day, he learned to take off to a low height and hover in the air almost without effort. On the third, he began bringing small things, blowing them with precise streams of air into Taman's hands. On the fifth, he developed a favorite trick. He lifted dust over the beds and then softly settled it back in an even layer, as if he himself knew how to plow the land. It was amazing. Taman understood. Dragons do not simply obey, they learn. And each new species brings a new function to the farm. If Garen was strength and protection, if Sinrin was water and restoration, then Veyron became movement, speed, reconnaissance. This was the first real sign that the farm could turn into a complex with distributed roles. And the more he thought about it, the more strongly he understood. The whole world still did not realize how terrifying a well-grown pack could become. It was after Veyron's appearance that the most dangerous guests came to the farm. Not officials and not diplomats, but people in gray clothes who left no traces at the gate and did not introduce themselves. They came at night when Veyron was circling over the field, Garen was sleeping by the storehouse, and Sinrin was guarding the water. Taman felt them before he saw them. The dragons raised the alarm. The air became hard, the humidity dropped, and then a dark shadow appeared over the fence. "Do not interfere," Taman whispered to Veyron when he sharply rose. But it was too late. One of the uninvited guests was already throwing a net wide metallic with an admixture of some magical powder. A good net, expensive, specially designed for young dragons. Taman cursed and grabbed the staff he kept by the door just in case. Garen woke instantly and rushed at the first person, knocking him off his feet. Sinrin struck the second with a damp wave, making him lose balance. And Veyron. Veyron did what Taman had not expected. He rose higher, sharply dived down, and blew the net aside before it had time to cover the dragons. Taman literally saw how the air baby, who only recently had barely been able to stay in the air, saved the farm. "Well done," he exhaled. But the attack was not over. Two more came out of the darkness. They were prepared. One held an artifact staff that created heavy pressure on the air. The second, a short blade with a red stone. Their goal was clear. Not to kill, but to take. The battle on the farm was short, but fierce. Taman was not a warrior, but he was no longer the confused farmer he had once been when he lived alone. He knew his land, knew the location of pits, stones, ditches, and shelters. He knew where the dragons could turn around and where they could not. Garen went head-on. Heavy, powerful, he crashed into the attacker with the staff, knocking him off his feet. Sinrin used water from the barrel, raising it into a whip that wrapped around the second man's hand and knocked the knife out of it. Veyron picked up sand and dust, blinding the enemies and changing the trajectory of their attacks. And Taman moved between them like a farmer in a field, only instead of a sickle he had a staff, instead of a furrow the space of battle. He did not seek to finish them off. He sought to drive them out, to endure, to protect. Finally, one of the attackers retreated and ran toward the forest. The other, wounded, remained lying on the ground. Taman raised the staff over him. "Who sent you?" The man was silent. Veyron dived beside him and released a short, sharp stream of air right into the prisoner's face. Not dangerous, but unpleasant enough. "Whom do you serve?" Taman repeated. The man spat and quietly said, "The Capital Department for Rare Bioforms." Taman froze. So this was no longer simply the crown. This was already a separate structure hunting specifically for what he was growing. From that moment, the farm stopped being simply a farm. It became a target. Taman understood. If he did not act immediately, the attacks would repeat, and each next one would be smarter. He gathered all his allies, Eden Liren, local workers, 2 old hunters whom he had hired to guard the perimeter, and began building a defense designed not against people but for a long siege. First a high wooden fence with metal inserts, then signal cords between the trees, then ditches hidden in the grass, then a training circle for the dragons, so that they could learn to act together. The 5 of them were already a real pack. Garen fire and the front line, Sinrin water and defense, Veyron air and reconnaissance, a green dragon named Rin earth, roots, stability, a silver little one named Leia light, reflection, and, as it turned out later, the ability to disrupt others' illusions. When Taemin saw them together, he no longer doubted. The dragon farm could become not just a farm, but an independent force. Rumors did their work. People began to come on their own. Some wanted to see the dragons, some hoped to buy a seed, some tried to offer money for a consultation. There were also honest people farmers who wanted to understand whether Dragonland could be adapted for ordinary crops. Taemin began cautiously selling not the seeds themselves, but knowledge, how to prepare the soil, how to maintain warmth, how to choose a place for different types, how to care for the fruit before hatching, how not to harm a newborn dragon. This turned out to be unexpectedly profitable. People who had money paid for secrets, and the poor for the chance to at least see the dragon nursery. The farm became a place of attraction, but along with this came a threat. The more famous the farm became, the harder it was to control who came with good intentions and who came with tools for theft. The Crown sent another letter. This time, it was not official, but almost friendly. Almost. Taemin understood. They were changing tactics. If it could not be taken by force, they could try admiration, rewards, and privileges. In the letter, he was offered the status of chief supplier of strategically important dragon material. Rewards. Land in the capital. A patent for the cultivation method, with the reservation that part of the knowledge would become state property. He laughed after reading it. State property. Of course. Eden, sitting beside him, only shook his head. They will not retreat, but perhaps now they fear you more than you fear them, Taemin thought. Perhaps that was true. His dragons no longer looked like a curiosity. They were power. A country in miniature. If someone wanted to take them away, he risked receiving not one guarded beast, but an entire system that protected itself. And the older the dragons became, the clearer it was. Their loyalty was not rent, not training, but a bond that could not be bought. At the end of summer, Veyron lifted into the air for the first time not only himself, but also Taemin. It happened unexpectedly. Taemin was simply checking how he handled short ascents, and the little dragon suddenly ducked under his arm, spread his wings, and with a powerful flap, threw his owner a couple of meters into the air. Taemin cried out, grabbed the straps he had managed to fasten in advance, and suddenly found himself above the field, above the beds, above the roofs of his own farm. The view from above struck him. All his work fences, nurseries, greenhouses, the stream, enclosures, paths, protective circles came together into a single picture. Not just a farm, but a living, breathing organism. Below, near the ground, Garen raised his muzzle and breathed a short pillar of flame toward an empty training target. Sinrin raised an even stream of water along the ditch. Rin pushed stone spikes out of the soil, and Leia reflected sunlight so that a blinding haze appeared around her. Taemin, hanging in the air, suddenly understood. He was no longer just a farmer. He was the creator of a dragon way of life. At the next gathering of local elders, one of them asked directly, "What will you do if an army comes?" Taemin did not dodge. Then it will see that this is not just a farm. This is territory where people, land, and dragons protect each other. The old men exchanged glances. You are too confident. I have lived alone for too long not to value what I built with my own hands. And he was not exaggerating. If at the beginning of his life someone had told him that he would become the owner of a pack of dragons, he would have laughed. Now this was not fantasy, but a craft built on patience, observation, and stubbornness. He understood that what came next would be even harder. Visits from the capital, attempts at bribery, spies, hunters after seeds, attempts to steal dragons whole or one by one, and possibly a war for the right to independence. But now he was no longer alone. Taemin discovered the most surprising thing in autumn. When old dragon plants withered after hatching, some of them left behind not 2 but 3 seeds if they were fertilized properly, and the fruits were not picked too early. This discovery overturned everything. If the cycle could be strengthened, if the quality of the soil influenced the number of seeds, if the dragons themselves helped the growth of the next generations, then the farm could not simply grow, it could accelerate. Taemin wrote down, checked, rechecked. He understood that one of the key mistakes of his first attempts had been that he relied too much on a miracle and not on a system. But now he had precisely a system: the right soil, the right heat, the right humidity, contact with hatched dragons, a protective environment without stress, gradual expansion of lines. Now the dragon farm was becoming not simply a legend but a technology, and that was far more dangerous for the world. One night, a man on a flying artifact appeared above the farm. He was not a merchant and not an ambassador. Judging by his equipment and manner of holding himself, he belonged to one of the internal capital structures working on secret assignments. He did not even try to hide. "Taemin!" he shouted from above. "In the name of the crown, hand over all eggs and seeds under guard." Garen roared so that the hands of the traveler on the artifact trembled. Veyron immediately rose higher and began circling nearby, not allowing him to stabilize his flight. Leia reflected the moonlight, blinding the pilot. Rin held the ground at the base of the fence to prevent foot reinforcements from passing through. Taemin saw for the first time how far the conflict had gone. Now they were even trying to make the sky someone else's. He grabbed his staff, went out to the middle of the yard, and answered loudly, "Tell the crown that dragons are not surrendered." The man above spat and threw some object down. It was a container with ash, most likely a growth-suppressing powder, intended to destroy dragon sprouts. But Veyron rushed downward, intercepted the container in the air, and hurled it with force toward the forest. And Garan, raising his head, exhaled such a stream of fire that the air above the field flared red. The Sky Thief understood. Today he had lost. After this incident, news of the dragon farm stopped being merely rare rumors. Now it was a problem of the state. Some wanted to recognize Taemin as a unique master and make an agreement. Others to seize control. Others to find out whether his method could be transplanted onto state lands. But Taemin himself no longer reacted to all this as an external threat. He perceived it as confirmation. He had done something so important that the world could no longer pretend it did not exist. The farm became a point of power, and the more pressure was put on it, the stronger it became. One late evening, when the wind moved softly across the fields and all the dragons had wandered off to their favorite places, Taemin sat on the hill at the edge of the farm and looked down. There were greenhouses, nurseries, a protective fence, water ditches, stone circles, young dragons, older dragons, working people, light in the windows, land that was no longer empty. Garen lay down beside him, pressing his side against Taemin's leg. Sinrin settled a little farther away by the water. Veyron circled in the sky, sometimes diving down after insects. Rin dug in the soil as if searching for another perfect planting hole. Leia sat on the fence and caught the moonlight. Taemin felt a strange calm. He was still a poor farmer by origin. He was still a man who had survived his father's death, cold, loneliness, and years of hard work. But now his hands were growing not only bread, they were growing the future. Many years later, historians would argue over who first called Taemin the dragon farmer. Merchants would swear that it was one of them. Old people would insist that the name came by itself, from the mouths of ordinary people. The court would pretend that it had been an official title approved by documents. But in truth, everything was simpler. The name was born from amazement and fear before what one lonely peasant had managed to do. Something neither mages nor lords nor royal agronomists could do. He did not tame dragons, he grew them. And every new fruit, every new seed, every newly hatched baby was not a resource and not a weapon, but a continuation of his home. And a home that knows how to grow can no longer be erased from the map. Winter came unexpectedly early. Not that merciless winter that had once killed Taemin's father, but another one quiet, dry, with white frost in the mornings, and a heavy sky under which the dragon farm stood like a little kingdom of warmth in the middle of a cold plain. By this time, Garen had already grown to the size of an adult warhorse. Sinrin had become faster and more precise than any hunting dog. Veyron had learned to circle above the field as if the air belonged only to him, and Rin and Leia began to show skills that Taimin had previously had no idea about. With Rin, everything was clear: earth, roots, support. But Leia, the silver dragoness with an unusually calm gaze, began doing something strange. As soon as a stranger with unkind thoughts appeared nearby, her scales began to glow with a dim white light, and the shadows around her seemed to straighten out. Illusions, disguise, hidden intentions, all of this near her seemed to lose power. At first, Taimin thought he was imagining it. Then he checked it several times, inviting people he suspected of unclean intentions to visit. Every time Leia was nearby, they began to get nervous, stumble over their words, or unexpectedly admit that they just wanted to look. "You are not just a dragon to me," he once said to her, gently scratching her silver neck. "You are also protection from lies." Leia narrowed her amber eyes and seemed pleased. The postal messenger who arrived a week after the first frost looked as if he had not slept for 2 days. He carried no crests. He carried no official papers. In his hands there was only a gray letter without a seal and a short phrase. This was handed over in the city. They said to deliver it urgently to the farmer with dragons. Taimin took the letter, and his heart immediately twitched unpleasantly. The letter was written in a nervous, almost ragged handwriting. "If you still consider yourself a free man, come immediately to the western warehouses of Rendic. The Royal Department for Rare Bioforms is preparing to seize your seeds under an emergency order. You are already being watched. If you are late, the farm will be declared an object of state necessity." There was no signature, but Taimin still understood who could have sent it. Someone among those who had not yet turned into an enemy. Someone from inside the system who did not like that power was going to take from a village farmer what he had grown with his own hands. Adin arrived almost immediately after that, and his face was gloomier than usual. "Now everything has become official," he said. "If before they pressured you indirectly, now they have found a formulation that allows them to consider your land necessary for state salvation. And if I refuse, then you will become a rebel in their papers." Taimin smirked. "I have been called all sorts of things for a long time already. That changes nothing." But inside he understood. It did. Very much so. He went to Rendic after all. Not because he trusted the letter, but because he wanted to see who exactly was trying to drive him into a corner. The western warehouses were located in the industrial quarter of the city, where the streets were narrow, stone-paved, and smelled of wet iron, soot, and stored grain. People in gray uniforms with crests of magical control were on duty at the gates. They let people through only by lists. Too organized for a spontaneous operation, too fast for an ordinary bureaucratic decision. Taimin did not come alone. Garen, Sinrin, and Veyron accompanied him to the city walls, after which they remained hidden behind a hill together with Eden and 2 of Lirin's guards. Leia remained on the farm because Taimin did not want to leave her already fragile connection with the beds for long. He was already being waited for at the warehouses. Not by soldiers, not by officials, but by the Magister Agronomist from the first visit Lankeo, the very one who had looked too attentively not at the dragons, but at the land. Now he looked different. Tired, tense, and far less confident. "You came," he said. "You sent a letter without a seal," Taimin answered. "That usually means either desperation or a trap." Lankeo exhaled shortly. "Both." They quickly moved away from the gates into a narrow warehouse passage where they could speak without extra ears. Lankeo explained that the Department for Rare Bioforms had long been watching the farmer with dragons, and now one of the high officials had decided to conduct an emergency requisition under the pretext of protecting the state. But Lankeo himself was against it. He saw that forced seizure would destroy the cycle and therefore deprive the crown of future benefit. "They do not understand that your farm is not a factory," he said. "It lives through connection. If the department takes the seeds and tries to reproduce the process in official conditions, it will get a dead result or aggressive dragons without attachment. And why are you telling me this? Taemin asked. The Magister was silent for a moment. Because I saw that you are not lying. Your dragons do not obey like slaves. They respond to care. That is rare, and if the state breaks it, we will lose not only a source of power, but also a chance at another model of relations. Taemin looked at him attentively. So you want to help? I want to prevent a catastrophe, and helping you is the only way to do it quickly. This already sounded honest. But from the far end of the warehouse came the sound of footsteps, and both fell silent. 3 men in gray cloaks entered the passage. Taemin instantly understood. These were not random people. Their movements were too quiet, their eyes too attentive, and their identical gloves had a thin impregnation of an anti-magic compound. Magister Lan, one of them said, you are asked to return. You have violated the internal secrecy regime. Lan Keo turned pale. I have violated nothing. You yourselves ordered me to bring him here for negotiations. The negotiations are over. Taemin almost laughed. Everything was predictable. They used the Magister as bait or as cover, an ordinary scheme. You want to take my farm, he said calmly. The state wants to secure a strategic resource. This is not a resource. Then refuse and see how long your dragons hold out against official suppression contours. With these words, one of the gray-cloaked men raised his hand. A ring flashed on his wrist, and a thin wave of suppression ran through the warehouse. Taemin felt it even without artifacts. The air became heavy, as if someone had squeezed his throat with an invisible palm. He stepped back, and then a deafening blow rang out behind the wall. Garen. The dragons could not hear everything, but they felt the threat. When a surge of magical suppression began on the farm, Veyron raised the alarm, Garen rushed toward the gates, and Sinrin released a cloud of damp fog into the air, hiding their path. Eden, not losing a second, led Liren's people around. At the warehouses, Taemin found himself between 3 sides: the officials, Magister Lan, and his own growing anger. He did not want to fight, not now, not here. But the gray-cloaked men were already moving forward. The first strike hit the wall near his head, the second at his legs. Taemin darted aside and saw complex grid contours begin to flare on the floor of the warehouse. A suppression circle. They had prepared for the seizure in advance. A trap! Lan Keo shouted. They sealed the warehouse? Taemin exhaled and did something he himself had not expected from himself. He took out a small pouch with soil from the farm, the very soil that already held traces of the dragon's heat, and threw it onto the line of suppression. The soil flared with a soft golden light. And the circle cracked. The magic was delayed for a fraction of a second. That fraction was enough for Garen, bursting through the broken side door to strike one of the gray-cloaked men directly with his shoulder, while Sinrin, slipping in after him, knocked another down with a water vortex. Now everything went not according to the officials' plan. Their contour had been designed for ordinary magical beasts, not for a pack grown on farmers' land and connected to its owner through daily care, rhythm, and contact. This was what they could not calculate. Veyron burst in from above, blinding the opponents with a silvery air cut. Rin, who had remained in the wagon outside, managed to send a root sprout through a crack in the warehouse floor, which wrapped around one of the gray-cloaked men's legs and knocked him off balance. Lan Keo, recovering from the shock, finally raised his magical staff. Enough, he shouted. You are violating your own law. This is not seizure, but violent capture. Your testimony no longer matters to anyone, the head of the squad answered coldly. You will be recognized as an accomplice. Taemin understood. Now there was no way back. He lunged forward, kicked a sack of anti-magic powder, scattering it across the floor, and immediately ran outside toward the light and wind. Garen burst out after him. Sinrin raised a watery curtain. Veyron spun above the roofs. The officials were left without a coherent scheme. They were forced to retreat. By evening, news of the clash had already reached the capital, but more importantly, it had also reached those who had to decide how to react to it. Now, the Department for Rare Bioforms found itself not in the role of a hunter, but in the role of an agency that had arranged an illegal operation which had failed in front of witnesses. Lan Kao stayed with Taemin until late at night. He was pale and angry, but relief could be read in his gaze. "They will not leave this as it is," he said. "But now you have time." "A little." "Time for what?" The Magister looked at the farmer and suddenly answered unexpectedly simply. "To become stronger than they are ready to admit." Taemin smirked. "I am already stronger than they think." "No," Lan Kao said. "So far you have only proven that you cannot be taken quickly. And those are different things." It was a good answer. Unpleasant, but good. The next night on the farm was different. Not anxious gathered. All the dragons seemed to understand that something greater than an ordinary fight with thieves had happened. They kept closer to the house than usual. Garen slept at the entrance, Sinrin by the water, Veyron circled high above, and Leia on the far fence caught the light and reflected it in a narrow, almost invisible pattern. Taemin walked between them, checking wounds, stroking one neck, adding soft dry grass for another. He understood one thing. When someone tries to take your home from you, the home becomes even more yours. He did not know how the conflict with the crown would end. He did not know whether it would be a trial, a siege, a purchase, deception, or war, but he knew something else. Now his dragons were large enough that the world could not ignore them. And this had already changed the rules. In the morning, he gathered everyone who lived on the farm permanently and said directly, "They will try to pressure us even harder. Perhaps they will come again. Perhaps they will send not officials but hunters, soldiers, or mages. But we are not giving up the farm, under any pretext." No one objected. Even the workers who had come from the village and received good pay already considered the farm their home. For many, this place had become the first where their labor was not considered a trifle. Eden nodded. "Then it is time to build a second line of defense." "A second?" "Yes, a perimeter not only against people, but also against bureaucracy. If they come again, they will have to deal with territory that officially cannot be seized without the consent of several parties." Taemin narrowed his eyes. "And you know how to do that?" "I am an old man," Eden said. "I know how to turn other people's greed into paper stupidity." Taemin laughed for the first time in several days. It was a good laugh, the kind that brings air back into the chest. In the evening, Leia climbed onto the highest post by the gate and unexpectedly released a thin line of light into the sky. At first, Taemin thought it was a play of reflections, but then he noticed the light did not disperse. It went farther, as if leaving a trace. Veyron was the first to understand what was happening and circled above the line. "What is that?" Taemin asked. Lan Kao, watching from afar, turned pale. "I have never seen anything like that," he whispered. "It may be a mark of ancient dragon resonance." Taemin turned to him. "Translate." The Magister swallowed. Some rare dragon lines can respond to strong places in the land. If Leia releases such light, it means there is something old nearby. Very old. Possibly even an ancient dragon nest or a forgotten source. Taemin froze. "Here? On my land?" Lan Kao slowly nodded. This was already too much. But along with anxiety came a feeling of fate. It seemed the dragon farm stood not simply on an empty field. It stood on something deep, hidden, possibly connected with the ancient history of these creatures. And if that was true, Taemin did not yet know what exactly was hidden beneath his home, but he already understood. The next harvest would change everything. The silver trace left by Leia in the sky lasted longer than it should have. It was not scattered by the wind, not torn by clouds, not lost in the darkness. The line of light slowly stretched beyond the farm, as if someone invisible had drawn a brush across the air and forgotten to finish the picture. Taemin stood by the gate and looked at this light with an unpleasant chill in his stomach. He had already understood the main thing. If Leia reacted this way, then beneath the farm there really was something ancient. Not simply emptiness, not an old well and not a forgotten pit, but a place that itself responded to dragon blood and land. Lan Keo, standing beside him, did not hide his anxiety. "It may be an old nest," he said, "or a place where a brood of ancient dragons was once kept. If so, then your farm stands right above a node of memory." "And what does that mean?" Timon asked. "That you may have planted your first seeds where the land itself already knows how to grow dragons." At these words, goosebumps ran over Tamon's skin. The path to the dungeon turned out to be not in the beds and not in the barn, but under the old stone well beyond the far edge of the farm. Tamon had known it since childhood, but had considered it long dried up. The well was blocked. The cover had sagged. No one had looked inside for years. However, when Leia approached the stone, she suddenly placed her paw on it and quietly sang low, almost imperceptibly. The stone answered, not with an explosion and not with magic, but with a soft, deep click, as if an ancient lock had simply grown tired of waiting. Taimin and Lan Keo exchanged glances. "So much for coincidence," the Magister said dryly. First, they lowered torches and ropes down. Then Taimin himself climbed first. Behind him, Lan Keo, and then 2 workers and Eden, who insisted that an old man with experience had to see what the farm might get itself into. Inside, it turned out to be not a well in the usual sense, but a narrow passage widening downward. The walls were smooth, in places covered with ancient soot and strange grooves resembling claw marks. The air was warm, too warm for a dungeon. "There was a source of heat here," Lan Keo whispered, touching the wall. And not simply a source, a controlled one. The lower they descended, the stronger a strange feeling became. Not danger, but recognition. As if the land did not resist the intrusion, but rather accepted them, checking whether they were worthy to see what was hidden. The lower hall turned out to be so unexpected that Toyman did not even immediately understand what was before him. It was not a crypt, not a cave, not ruins, it was a garden. Underground, in a huge rounded cavity stretching far into the darkness, there grew glowing mosses, thin roots, strange grasses with leaves like ribbons, and dozens of plants that did not need sunlight. Along the walls stretched niches with crystals giving off a soft golden glow. Across the floor ran stone-lined channels through which warm water flowed slowly. Underground agriculture. Lan Keo exhaled. Taiman did not answer. He looked at all of it and felt both delight and horror at the same time. Because the garden was not simply old, it was arranged to grow life in the absence of the sun. And in the center of the hall stood a stone bowl entwined with 3 bronze rings. Dragon symbols were carved on its rim. Leia suddenly carefully approached the bowl and froze. From the depths rose a barely audible sound, neither the rustle of wings nor a distant breath. And then, from the black shadow above the bowl, an eye slowly opened. Taimin recoiled. Lan Keo instantly raised his hands, preparing a spell, and Eden cursed through his teeth. The eye was enormous, golden, and very old. Then the darkness stirred, and from it appeared the head of a dragon so large that all his other charges beside him would have seemed like puppies. The scales were dark as obsidian, with veins of green and silver light. The horns curved backward, the wings folded. The dragon did not rise. He seemed to have lain here for hundreds of years, maintaining stillness. But he was alive. Leia, without flinching, lowered herself before him onto her front paws. And then Taimin understood. She was not afraid. She recognized him. "Is this an elder dragon?" he asked quietly. Lan Keo turned pale. "No," the Magister said barely audibly. "This is an ancient progenitor, possibly one of those from whom the lines of the current species came." The dragon slowly inhaled, and the air in the cave trembled. "Who awakened us?" A low voice sounded directly in their heads. Taiman was not ready for this, but there was nowhere to retreat. He stepped forward and, with difficulty suppressing a tremor, answered aloud. "I did. I grow dragons on the surface. I did not know that there was another hall underground." The eye of the ancient dragon slowly turned toward him. "You grow seeds from the memory of the land?" "Yes. And they listen to you." Taimin nodded. The dragon was silent for a long time. Then he slowly raised one paw and touched the stone bowl. From this touch, a wave of light passed through the underground garden, and the small plants along the walls moved in sync, as if waking up together with him. "Incredible!" Lankeo whispered. The ancient dragon looked at Taimin again. "You are not a master, you are a gardener." It sounded not like an insult, but like recognition. And for some reason, these words made Taimin feel lighter. The old dragon did not give his name immediately. He first asked for water, then light, then a touch of the earth. Taimin, Leia, and Sinrin, who had come down later, fulfilled all the requests. And only when the Ancient One felt that the cave had come alive again, did he slowly say, "I was called Orhan." The name meant nothing to Taimin, but Lankeo sharply straightened. "Orhan," he whispered. "In the chronicles of the Royal Archive, there are mentions of the first keeper of the dragon lines, of a being that was once connected with the land, seeds, and stone nests. He was considered a myth. Orhan did not deny it. Myths are convenient for those who are afraid to remember," he said. "When people stopped understanding how to grow dragons, they began buying them. When they stopped buying, they began hunting. When hunting became difficult, they locked away the knowledge." Taimin stood, clenching his fists. "So my method." "Not yours," Orhan corrected. "Old, very old. You simply returned it without knowing it." The words of the ancient dragon overturned everything for Taimin. His farm, it seemed, was not a random point on the map, but a continuation of something forgotten important. The underground garden, stone channels, crystals, bowls, ancient symbols. All of this was part of a system that allowed dragons to be grown in harmony with the land, not by force. "Why did you sleep here?" Taimin asked. "Because walls of fear were built above us. Then walls of greed. Then walls of power. I waited for the one who would plant the seed correctly again." "And that was me?" "You and your poverty," Orhan answered. "The poor are usually more attentive to what they receive. They are in no hurry to break what they do not understand." It was cruel and honest at the same time. Lankeo could no longer hide his admiration. "So your farm is not just a household. It is the restoration of an ancient line. And the current dragons." "Descendants," Orhan said, "but not the same as before. Every century changes the blood. Every generation brings its own character." Taimin looked at Leia and Veyron. Now everything was falling into place. Orhan could not rise immediately. He was too old and had slept too long. But he could pass on knowledge. And his first gift was not an artifact, but a method. He taught Taimin how to prepare the so-called deep soil, a mixture of earth, bark, ash, mineral sand, and special algae that could be grown without light. This soil was capable of accelerating seed development and increasing the chance of rarer species appearing. "On the surface you grow dragons," Orhan said, while Taimin and Lankeo wrote down every word. "Here you can grow them deeper. Not only faster, but also more precisely. If you want fiery ones, add warm ash. If air ones, mix in stone dust and dry salt. If earth ones, roots and clay. If light ones, crystal flour and reflective dust." Taimin listened and understood that before him was not simply an ancient beast, but an entire library of living agronomy. "This will change everything," Lankeo whispered. "Yes," Orhan agreed. "And that is exactly why many will want to destroy it." When Taimin returned to the surface, everyone on the farm already felt the change. The dragons became more restless. The soil in the greenhouses heated up more than usual. And Leia sat at the gate all night, as if guarding the entrance not only from the outside, but also from within. He told everything only to the most reliable ones: Eden, Lankeo, and 2 senior workers. Not to the others yet. Too dangerous. Eden listened silently, then said, "So under your farm you have not simply a treasure, but the legacy of an entire species." "Looks like it." "Then everything becomes even worse." Taimin smirked. "Or even better." Eden shook his head, but respect flashed in his eyes. "In your case, that is one and the same." Taimin thought for the first time that the old man might be right. Lankeo, despite the shock, insisted on an official report. He did not want someone else to learn about the ancient dragon too early and come here with an army. Therefore, a document was drawn up with cautious wording. An underground biological resonator has been discovered. There is a possibility of an ancient line. Research is recommended under the joint control of an independent farmer and the Magical Council. This will give us time, he said. If the capital is interested only in control, they will first want to study, not destroy. And while they study, you will strengthen the farm. And if they want to take Orhan? Timon asked. Lan Keo was silent for a moment. Then they will have a problem. And this was perhaps the first time a representative of the crown said something resembling real support. Orhan turned out to be right. After the awakening of the Ancient One, new seeds began to appear in the soil around the underground garden, small, dense, with an unusual internal structure. They were nothing like the previous ones. Some were darker, others lighter. And some dust of light seemed to be rotating inside. Taemin noticed that if a seed was placed closer to a warm channel, it ripened more fiery. If near a crystal, lighter. If near a moist niche, softer and calmer. The old dragon explained. Now you do not simply have a farm, you have an ancestral greenhouse. And with every generation, the offspring will not only grow, but also remember. Remember what? Taemin asked. The warmth of a hand, the smell of the earth, the path home. It was beautiful and frightening. Because if dragons remember, then they are not simply animals, they are heirs. The first new seed from the deep soil gave not an ordinary little dragon, but a creature with almost transparent wings and scales the color of dark glass. It hatched underground, right in the garden, and immediately spread its wings, as if knowing it had been born in the right place. Taemin lowered himself to one knee beside it. The creature slowly crawled toward him and touched his palm with its nose. And suddenly Taemin felt something strange. The connection was deeper than with the previous dragons. Not simply acceptance as a parent, but almost conscious recognition. This one is different, he said quietly. Orhan nodded. Because he was born underground, where the memory of the root is kept. He will hear what others do not hear. Lan Keo no longer hid his delight. This is a discovery of historical scale. Taemin looked at the little creature and understood that the world had truly changed. Of course, the secret could not remain a secret. Even the best paper in the world cannot withstand the pressure of greedy eyes. People appeared in the area again this time, not officials and not envoys, but professional seekers who prowled the forests and asked too many questions about the light underground. Taemin understood what this meant by only one sign. On the far hill one night, he saw a small campfire that should not have been there. They found the trail, Eden said. What kind? Uneven. Draconic. Someone already knows that there is an ancient nest here. Taemin was not surprised. He only clenched his teeth. Then it is time to end the secrecy. Eden nodded. Yes, now it can no longer be hidden, only protected. Taemin, together with Lan Keo and Eden, developed a new plan. Now the farm had to become not simply a farm, but a fortified complex capable of withstanding a raid. They decided to seal Orhan's lower garden with a separate stone ring and guard it only with trusted people. On the surface, additional greenhouses were built where only young seeds were grown. The beds between the house and the forest were planted with aromatic plants that repelled other people's beasts. Signal threads were installed around the perimeter, and Veyron received a permanent task: aerial patrol. Garen and Sinrin had to be ready for active defense. Rin for protecting the soil and strengthening the ditches. Leia for detecting disguise. The new glass underground dragon for hidden observation. Underground. Taemin saw for the first time how his farm was acquiring the structure not simply of a household, but of a small state. To lure out those who were already following the trail, Taemin and Lan Keo decided to launch a false rumor. That on the surface there were extra seeds of a new type that did not require the underground garden. It was bait. And as expected, it worked. 2 days later, the first buyers appeared, people with money but without official documents. Then messengers from private houses. Then one of those whom Eden immediately recognized as a rarity hunter. Taemin met them in the outer yard. "You need seeds?" he asked calmly. "Depends on which ones," the hunter answered. The ones that grow dragons." The man's eyes gleamed. "And how much do you want?" "First show who sent you." The hunter grinned. "And if I do not show—" Taemin nodded toward the hill, where the shadows of Garen and Veyron were already gliding in the mist. "Then I will show you what happens when someone tries to buy the wrong forest." The clash was short but demonstrative. The hunters came with an artifact net, 3 trapping needles, and 1 suppression scroll. All of this against a farm where the air was already saturated with dragon warmth. Veyron was the first to break the plan, raising wind-blown dust and knocking off their aim. Sinrin flooded the lowland with a thin stream of water. Rin called roots from the earth that wrapped around the legs of 2 attackers. Garen simply came out head-on and did not allow anyone to approach the gate. Taemin did not finish them off. He had never wanted to turn into an executioner, but he already understood that protecting a home was also a choice. One of the hunters, lying in the mud, clenched his teeth. "This is not just a farm, it is a fortress." "No," Taemin answered, looking down at him. "It is a home." After this attack, it became clear that returning to the old life was already impossible. The dragon farm became a center around which the interests of the crown, private houses, magical councils, hunters, and even people who simply wanted to live near something strong and not fear winter began to revolve. Orhan, awakened in the depths of the earth, told Taemin a very simple thing. Once dragons were grown, not for power, but for balance. Remember that. If you make an army out of them, the world will break you. If you make a people out of them, the world will be forced to reckon with you. Taemin was silent for a long time. Then he looked at his pack, at the land, at the light in the greenhouses, at Leia's silver trail, and at the children from the village who now ran around the farm and looked at the dragons with delight, not fear. And he understood. This was it. Not simply growing, not simply protection, but the beginning of a new world where dragons would be not a rarity and not a weapon, but part of life. Years later, people would come to this valley not only for seeds, but also for advice. They would ask how to prepare the soil, how to speak with a young dragon, how not to break the connection between a grown creature and its home. New underground gardens would be built. Lines of deep soil would appear, separate schools for caring for dragon cultures. And Taemin? He would still get up early, check the beds, feed the young ones, argue with Lankeo about soil compositions, and laugh when Garan once again tried to squeeze into the storehouse for meat. And every time looking at his dragons, he would remember that quiet forest water, where he had once noticed a glowing seed. Back then, he did not yet know that he had found not simply a curiosity. He had found a destiny that had decided to grow together with him.